Is it packed?
No. 17th floor Yorkville.
Okay, alrighty.
You see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint.
Excellent. So do you want me to wait until Chris and Amir make it to your room?
I think we can start. It's going to be just a couple of minutes.
Okay. So this is the mentoring session for the TRMIS high-level view of the solution. I've got this scheduled for 2 hours, and I'm not sure that everything that I'm going to go through will take that long, but with questions and potentially looking at the system itself, it may end up going to that point. So we'll see how long it actually takes. This is just an estimation.
Okay.
So the agenda is, first I'm going to talk through a high level of the components that TRMIS uses. And the point of me having all this in here is that I can then send this out after the meeting as well, and you can use it as a reference. Then we'll go through the high-level workflow overview. Then we'll talk briefly about the TRMIS data feeds, not in a lot of detail, but just grouping them into what their purposes are so that it's easier to identify what ones you need to look at when there's an issue in a certain area of the workflow. And last, to conclude with essentially the major reporting goal of this whole solution in Archer. What is the main reason they've got this going on, and how are they getting the information they're looking for? So, oops. So first is the component overview. So TRMIS has a number of applications, questionnaires, and subforms that they use as part of their solution, workflow. And here I've listed them out, and anything that's in red is a shared component. So these applications, which I haven't broken out in here who it's shared with, but I can do that at the detailed level. Yeah, so the things that aren't shared are control standards, devices right now. I confirmed that BCM was at one point using it, but is no longer. Storage devices and technologies. So the core applications and the ODA applications are broken out here. And the point of me doing this is so that you can see the applications that came out of the box, that came with Archer when they bought the different solutions. And you can see the number of on-demand applications, the number of brand new applications that were created for TRMIS, and that are being used as part of the on-demand license right now. So you can see that there's 7 on-demand applications that TRMIS is using right now. They were using 9 in CRD, but the Greenleaf ticketing system and release note management applications are no longer being used. Now we're utilizing the JIRA system. So they dropped their usage to 7, and 2 of them are shared. The data feed applications are obviously shared between all the different tenants because they like to see if their data feeds completed successfully or faulted or had any warnings during the night. I wrote here historical data on question library because the question library was used to populate questions in their original control design assessment questionnaire. But as they've changed what they're using for that control design assessment now, they don't actually need the question library because they're using different applications, and I'll show you that later. So they're not utilizing it currently, but it has the historical question data in it. So it's still important to keep in mind that though they're not using it right now, they may use it again, and it does house historical data for them.
That's Stephanie. Quick question. Would you like to have questions while you do the presentation, or have it in the end of the presentation? How would you like to go?
I think that it would be useful to have questions as we go along, because we don't want to, if there's something you want to hit on, we don't want to forget it. And I really don't think that I'm going to stretch this out all the way to 2 hours, so it's probably okay to have questions while we go.
Okay, you're getting one question now.
Yeah, no problem.
So, earlier you said red ones are the shared components.
Yes.
Right? Now, I was under impression that devices and storage devices are the shared components. Is that something right, or am I only the red? Am I just confused? No, the devices and storage devices, are they shared components or not?
They are not, because they are not red. Devices, when BCM began development, they did start utilizing devices at an earlier time, but before they reached the merge, before they finished development, they decided no longer to utilize devices, so they don't actually use it anymore. They were considering it at one point.
Okay.
But it's no longer a shared component, which is why we don't have to confer with anyone on the changes that we're doing on devices and storage devices as part of Release 1A.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
But it's good to keep in mind that in the future, anything that's not shared could become shared if someone's decided, I want to use that now.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is as of right now, but you never know when someone will want to use something else. So it's a bit of a point in time for the moment. So these are the applications, obviously. And then the next list is the questionnaires used by TRMIS. So following TRMIS's questionnaires is very simple because there's only 3 of them, and one of them isn't really actually used anymore. So they used to have the control design assessments done through a questionnaire, the first one you see, and they've actually renamed it Archive Control Design Assessments because they want to keep the data that they were collecting when they were using it, but they're actually using a different process now. So it's, again, historical data. They're not actually physically going through and using that questionnaire anymore, but it's still important that we preserve the data that's in there because they still use it as references to what's been done previously in auditing and such.
So how long are we archiving this data for?
Currently, I don't think there's a plan to ever remove it.
Oh.
I don't think anyone's, I'm not sure, you'd have to ask TRMIS if they've exported any of these questionnaires and saved them anywhere, but I think currently the plan is just to leave the questionnaires that have been completed in the system. Maybe a future conversation needs to be had about preserving it or backing it up, or if there's a need to remove it at some point.
Yeah, we're keeping for 7 years. I think that's the
standard one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We need to project for it. So that's something we can discuss.
Thank you.
Yep. So then obviously the second one is the business application risk assessment, which you've heard of, called the BARA. This is the broken out name, and I tried to make sure that I used the full name in the slides as much as I could. I think maybe I've used BARA once, but eventually with going through the solution to use it, you'll understand every time TRMIS says BARA, they mean the business application risk assessment. And then there's a third questionnaire called the Infrastructure Threat Vulnerability Assessment. This is not so widely used right now. As part of one of the last few changes that went into CRD, they put in some changes for technologies and added this questionnaire. And I'm not sure how many people are utilizing it right now or how well it's utilized, but it's still something that was put in and is there and may need support in the future if they start utilizing it on a wider scale. And then the subforms used by TRMIS, there's 2. One of them is the questionnaire comments, and questionnaire comments is a subform on almost well, I think every single questionnaire. It's when you have a questionnaire and there's a little sticky note on it. When you add a comment on that sticky note, that's the questionnaire comment subform. It's just part of all questionnaires. So essentially, anyone who has that sticky note functionality in their questionnaire is using this subform. So it's one of the more heavily shared components. So if any changes are to be done on the comments itself, it has to be talked to everyone about that. But currently, since that's part of their archives control design assessment usage, they're not using it right now. So again, it's historical data, but any changes that wants to be made on it needs to still be discussed because it will remove what they had visible previously in their questionnaires.
Stephanie, earlier I was in KRCSA training, and in that training they mentioned the sticky notes. Once they are added, they would remain there forever. Is that right, or am I mixing up?
If you add a sticky note, yeah, it becomes a record in that subform.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like having a questionnaire record or an application record that unless someone deletes it, it stays there.
Oh, you have an option to delete it?
You could delete it if the rights are there for it, but as long as no one goes in and starts deleting records, that information will remain there. But if you change the layout of the questionnaire comments, you will also change the data in those records. So if they have a description field and you were to remove that off the layout, their descriptions would disappear.
Okay.
The information would still be there off layout, but they wouldn't see them. So it's still important to have a conversation about if someone wants to make a change on that component. I mean, it's shared between everyone, so everyone needs to be part of that conversation anyway. Yep. And then the other subform is a long name, but essentially it's used to translate comments that TRMIS users make on focus area assessments, which I'll get to later, onto findings. This one's not shared, so it's, again, a one-off that TRMIS is using, so it doesn't affect anyone if they want to make any changes on that. So I think that's all in the component overview. Is there any quick questions on these? Or anywhere you want me to go into later for more detail?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, I don't want to actually interrupt you, but I was thinking we can actually see on the actual Archer application would be more beneficial for some of us.
Yeah, so depending on how long the presentation itself goes, we can see how much diving into Archer we can do itself. But this is supposed to be a high level and an overview, so we shouldn't be getting into too much detail until we get to the detailed level information.
Okay.
So for the moment, we'll work on it and see where we can fiddle around in Archer later. So the workflow overview. So the first thing that the user starts with is obviously an applications record. There's 3 sources, but only 2 of them are used by TRMIS. ITPM, which means that this record came in either through a data import currently or through the applications data feed when it moves to production. This is something that currently exists in AVOR or EVOR, and information that's come in has come from that application book of records. The second source is TRMIS manual. These records are created manually by TRMIS users in Archer, mainly because this application doesn't exist in AVOR or EVOR yet, and they want to start doing their risk assessments ahead of schedule. So the information that's put in there is manually input by the user that's created the application, and the goal is that when that application does move into AVOR or EVOR in the future, they've already got most of this information laid out, and they can continue doing risk assessments on it instead of having to start at square one already. And again, the third source is BCM manual, but TRMIS can't see these records, so I'm not going to really talk about those.
So, Stephanie, sorry.
Yep.
Can you please go to the previous slide?
Pardon?
Previous slide. Can you go to previous slide?
Oh, yep. Sorry.
So the manually created records. You know, we had some issue yesterday related to the business units and divisions. They are manually created, therefore they are not picked up by the data feeds. Now, the solution we found out was hardcode if there is no further addition happening. Correct? Are we going to do the same for this instance?
No.
Okay.
This is different.
Okay.
This is fine that they make manual applications.
Mm-hmm.
The point is that they can get a jump start on their risk assessments ahead of schedule,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have to wait until it comes into the application book of record to think of these things. So this is intentionally made so that they can have the ITPM apps and the manual apps, and there will be no issues with having both.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a quick question too. Like, I mean, when you create the new record, it says if you manually create, it says TRMIS record, right, from source?
Yes. So if you were there's different ways to add an application depending on what group you're associated with. But TRMIS has the ability to see in the navigation menu applications and click Add New there. And when they do, it automatically says TRMIS manual because we've defaulted it to be that way. When BCM is adding a new application, they have to go through a different process, and that process will flag the record to be a BCM manual one.
Okay. My question is actually when record gets created through the actual manual process, which is TRMIS manual. So when we do import from data feed, would this be updated?
No, they only update the ITPM application.
Only the ones coming from the data feed that they updated by the data feed then.
So the records that come in through the application data feed are of source ITPM because they exist in AVOR and EVOR.
Yeah, yeah.
The TRMIS manual apps do not exist there yet.
Okay. Well,
that's why we created a manual app for it, because it doesn't exist there, so there's nothing to update.
Oh, okay. So basically the okay. So assumption is that there shouldn't be there when they enter the manual. But what if they make mistake? Let's say it's already existing in the ITPM, they entered manually.
I believe that TRMIS well, they have a whole user guide, and I'm pretty sure they've been told that they should look up their application in Archer before making a manual one.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a point where at some point your application, the one that you've created manually, will exist in AVOR, and it will come in through that data feed one day. And TRMIS has realized that at some point there has to be either like they're already exporting the information they've been working on, the risk scores, etc. But they have had conversations about how do we take whatever is attached to the manual app and move it over to the ITPM one when it comes in, and they haven't flushed that whole thing out yet. But I do know that's a future area of exploration that they want to work on, but they haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay, you mean there's a possibility?
So I mean, let's say we might have already manually created, but it might be coming from the ITPM, possibly. I was wondering if it gets updated, or if it's I don't know how to behave. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Getting your question, yeah. If there are manually created and the application ITPM has those records, then whether it is going to update or is it going to create the new records?
So if there's say you have a TRMIS manual application named Stephanie's application, and Stephanie's application gets added to AVOR eventually. It'll come into the data feed. It'll create a new ITPM app called Stephanie's application.
Yeah.
You'll also have a TRMIS manual application that's called Stephanie's application. That's understood. TRMIS is expecting this right now.
Okay, so they're expecting to have both of them.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're all right with that. The future thing that they will explore is how they will move the records that are cross-referenced. So there's control procedures and control standards and findings and everything attached to the manual one.
Mm-hmm.
They can go through and manually link them all to the new one, but I think a future area of exploration for them will be how they move them potentially automatically, but that hasn't been explored yet. So currently they're understanding that there'll be 2 apps in the system, and they have to work with that, but they're all right with that.
Okay.
So I have just 2 screenshots for you showing 2 different applications. I used dev, so the naming of these applications may not be accurate to what production will show, but this is an example of 2 different applications, one that's an ITPM version and one that's a TRMIS manual version. So that's where you can find the distinguishing source. So now that they have an application, either it came in through the data feed or they've manually created it themselves, the user will now create for this application with the intent of filling in where are my risks on this application and how intense are they depending on the categories. So when an application comes in and it hasn't had any risk scores done on it yet, it starts at insignificant, and then after they do this questionnaire, they will end up with anywhere from insignificant to extensive risk in key areas. So this is the top of a BERA. I'm showing that it's targeting on the one-click application that we looked at previously. And from here, they start doing this BERA, filling in different sections and generating risk scores for each risk profile in the application record. So there's 8 different risk profiles, they call them, on the application. And in each of these areas, they need to identify how extensive is their risk in each of these areas, and the BERA helps them complete that by first asking for if you have any risk in these areas in the first place. Like, you may have an application that doesn't have to do with privacy. All the information is like a public information kind of application. Then you don't have to address your privacy because you have no risk in that area. But perhaps there's a potential for fraud or theft in that application, then you have to address the risk in that area. So you'll answer if you have a risk in those areas, and then each of these sections break out into questions about that area to give you your how intensive your risk score is. And in the detailed sessions, we'll go into this in a lot more detail, but just a quick overview of this is what we're doing today.
So one BARA application, so one BARA application would have the questionnaire, and the questionnaire is categorized based on the risk. And there are 8 risks that have these questions. And once you fill those questions, then BARA would have the information required for the risk assessment, correct?
Correct. So the BERA is the risk assessment. It is the questionnaire. And once it's approved, it fills in all the risks that you've identified on the application record. So in the previous screenshot, had created a brand new business application risk assessment, and I added, you can see in this screenshot that it's the one on the top, the one that hasn't been completed, it's unassigned, it has insignificant everywhere. Because it hasn't been approved, none of that rolls up to the application. It's only after business review complete and it's been approved that you see that there's a major in third party, there's a moderate in disaster. those will now populate on the application record, which is what you're looking at here, and show, oh, look, I have a major and third party. I have a moderate and disaster.
So,
Stephanie,
sorry. When it comes to application approval process, does it go through any other workflow, or is it something after you save it, it goes to the concerned person and then it gets approved? How does that work?
The high level of it is essentially the BTRM goes in, they complete all the sections, they save it, and then they change the status to that it's complete and it's pending the business application reviewing it. The business application owner comes in, says either I reject it and they have to do some more work, or I approve it, the date fills in, and all this information rolls up to the application.
Okay, so basically once the BTRM analyst fills it in, and upon saving with changing the status for review, it goes to the business application owner, and business application owner is the one who either approves or rejects, and that's where the approval process completes here for the BARA. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. And yeah, once it's been completed, a notification goes to the business application owner to come in, because normally they don't log into Archer and check these things. So so they're prompted that they need to come in and do the approval.
Sorry, Stephanie. Sorry to stop. What if the business application owner didn't approve it, say in case it is rejected? How does the workflow work?
That's probably going to be more in our detailed session.
Okay.
If it's rejected, essentially, when the BTRM logs back in, they can see that that has been rejected and they need to work on it again.
Okay.
And then flip it back to completed when they've reviewed the comments that the business application owner has left them.
Okay.
So, yes. So you can see where these risks are, and that there's been a change in 2 of the areas. Because, again, when it comes in, it starts off in all insignificant, and now we've got some risk in third party and disaster. So now that that's been completed, waiting overnight, which I think all of TRMIS' data feeds are overnight data feeds. So overnight, 2 specific data feeds will run, and they will look at this risk profile that's been updated in the last screenshot and say, okay, so we have a major and third party. There's control standards that are associated with how you address that risk. So the first one runs and says, what are the risk profiles we need to address? And the second one runs and says, let's add control standards to this application to address this risk. So in the second screenshot, you can see the required control standards, and underneath there's another section that says key control standards. All of these were added by a data feed as the required standards that need to be addressed for your risk in those areas. Make sense?
I'm kind of lost here.
So you have risk in, what was it again? So you have a major risk in third party, which, how do you address that risk? Well, there's standards in place that say, that tell you what you have to do in order to address the fact that you have a risk there, right? So all that's happening in this stage is, what are the control standards I need to make sure that I have in place in order to, or that address my risk in these areas?
Okay.
So, like you can see, like the first one's talking about backup and restore. So this is a standard for your backup and restore. The next one is accountability for classification of data. This is the standard for your data classifications. And these are the things that apply to having a major risk in that area.
So this is only for the third-party major risk. And you mentioned the feeds would be providing something. That's where I'm
yeah, so on this application, before those feeds run, the control standards there's no control standards linked here. It's blank.
Ah.
When the feed runs, it says, okay, these are the control standards that need to be addressed when you have a major risk in third party and a moderate risk in disaster.
So let's say the risk is not major. In that case, when these data feeds run, are control procedures still going to pop up, or are the control procedures still going to have information or not?
It will still have information because you still have, so anything that's moderate, major, or extensive has a set amount of control standards that need to be fulfilled in order for you to mitigate your risk in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an insignificant risk, you don't need a standard on that. If you have a minor risk, you don't need a standard because it's a very small amount of risk. But if you get to a moderate risk, well, that's a little, if you need a standard to mitigate that. If you have a major risk, you definitely need standards to address it. And if you have an extensive risk, you're going to have a lot of standards that need to be fulfilled in order to mitigate and reduce your risk in those areas.
So now, are these data feeds based on the risk level, or is this like a one standard data feed which runs for all the risk levels, and then based on the risk levels, the options going to populate on this control standard?
It's one data feed. The logic behind what standards are required is actually based on the risk profile. So having a major in third party, and the standard itself saying, I'm required when you have a major third party or an extensive third party risk.
Okay. Now, how often does this feed run?
Every night.
Every night. So if I create a bara today, and if that bara has major risk vendor, third party vendor as a major, then it has to wait for the overnight to get to the stage, correct?
As long as the bear has been approved, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
The only situation where that doesn't apply is if you've already completed a BERA before and your risk has either decreased or remained the same because there's no new standards that apply to your risk, right? Because you've already addressed your previous risk rating, or if you've gone down in risk, there's even less standards you need to apply against.
So I'm just curious why the data feed is overnight, why not hourly?
Because then you would make production crawl.
Mm-hmm.
All of these data feeds running during the day would severely impact performance.
Stephanie, do we add this to the risk register and generate a finding? Is that part of the workflow?
No. The short answer is no. Findings are generated, but that's later in the. So right now you've just said, at this point you've said, I have an application, I have risk in these areas, and these are the control standards I'm going to need to address.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the next stage is now that I know what I need to address, do I address it? So fourth, the BTRM goes into the application, and it'll tell you if you've got new control standards attached to your application, you're going to need a new control design assessment. It's going to say, yes, it's required. However, the TRMIS wanted to make it up to the BTRM whether they generate a control design or not at that very moment. So there's actually the generate a control design assessment flag. If they say, yes, I want to generate a new control design assessment, then overnight they're going to have a new control design assessment, regardless of whether it's telling them they need one or not. It's up to them to say it. So here I'm just showing a person selecting, yes, I want a new control design assessment. And then overnight, 4 data feeds, the 4 I've shown here, will run, and it'll create a control design assessment. It will create focus area assessments, which are, I'll get into more detail, but they are, each control standard has a focus area, just to group them together so that you're not answering, previously they were answering 260 questions on control standards. they've now grouped them into focus areas so they can address like an area like access provisioning and access review, attestation of remediation. And each of these focus areas have a assessment that is done on them.
So Stephanie, any of these feeds are in reference to the feed we had before for control standards?
Are these reference to it?
Yeah. Because
I think they're set up so that they currently they're scheduled to reference off of the updating the control standards.
okay. Because before even we get to here, first we need to have that data feed run, the control standards, right? Which has the logic for risk levels. And
yeah,
after
that's
that,
why we're doing it in this order.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so this is all in order. The order has to go in. If you do it in another order, nothing works.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
So it creates a control design assessment, which is the container for all the focus area assessments. It creates the focus area assessments themselves, and then it populates the focus area assessments with any information that's already been completed previously. If there is none, then they remain blank, and they're starting from square one anyway.
So
Well?
Stephanie, just a quick question. So we had like a 2 data feeds running prior to this step. I was wondering if that's actually everything happens overnight or happens one night and the other night after the next day. Does it make sense?
I don't think I understand your question.
Okay. So at very beginning, we create the application record gets created manually, either coming from the data feed, right?
Mm-hmm.
The record gets created, and then overnight it creates the risk rate. I think that's what happens with the 2 data feeds.
After you've completed the business application risk assessment.
Yeah. So it runs to 2 data feeds, and then these 4 data feeds, do they run? I know it's running every night, but do they update the same record at the same time as those 2 data feeds, or the day after?
Everything, so all of these feeds run every single night, but they're all scheduled to run in a specific order.
Okay. So
or
basically,
take reference so that they always go in a correct order.
So 6 of them are just everything happened at the same. So we see the risk as well as this control design the day after then, after creating the records.
Yeah, as long as, so if you've completed a BERA and you know you're going to need a control design assessment, that night you can click yes. Otherwise, you can wait until the next day and go along and say, oh, do I need a new control design assessment?
Okay.
And if they do, they can select yes. And it all depends on how quickly they want to go through this workflow. They can wait till the next day and then see, or they can do it that night because they know they're going to need one anyway.
Oh, if they select yes, and then the 4 of the data kicks in and the update the information. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. That was my.
Yep. So, I've given you a screenshot of the control design assessment, which essentially is a container for all of the individual focus area assessments. There's, I believe, 35 different focus areas, which may or may not need to be addressed depending on what standards apply to that application. You may only, if you only have, one standard attached to your application because you only have a little bit of risk in one area, you're only going to have one focus area assessment. But if you have extensive risk in all your areas, you're going to have all 35 focus areas to go through and assess. So once this has all been completed, they come in the next day. They see I have a new control design assessment, and I have all these focus areas assessments to complete. They start working on their focus area assessments. So the purpose of the focus area assessment is to have them address, are we addressing the risk in this specific area of standards? And they can say yes, no, or I'm not sure. That the answer is more of how they feel about that, but the way that they actually address if they're satisfying their control standards is by attaching control procedures. So control procedures are linked to control standards, and essentially they're used to satisfy that control standard. So, do I have, the standard could be you need to have 8-character passwords with 1 capital letter and a special character. Your control procedure could be the password field will not accept any characters less than 7. It forces the requirement of 1 capital letter and a special character. That control procedure satisfies that control standard, thereby mitigating that risk. And I'll get into this again later more. So doing the focus area assessments, they attach control procedures to show where they're satisfying that risk. And in the end, they'll also identify where they're not satisfying control standards potentially, and that's where they're going to have to address the risk that's remaining.
So, Stephanie, you mentioned that the focus areas would have attachments, right, in the control standards. Now, how is that related? If focus area question that you highlighted has S,
the focus area assessment?
Over there, the question answer that you have, focus area question answer. If S is selected, then is it required to add control standard design attachment?
Yes.
Okay.
The question answer is more of getting the BTRM to think about the question itself. Am I satisfying this? If they're confident about it, they can say yes. If they don't think they're doing anything, they can say no. Or they can say that I'm not sure, and that's okay. They can say I'm not really sure, but I'm going to attach some procedures and see where I go with this. It's just helping the person who approves this later on know if these people feel that they understand that they are mitigating a risk or they're not mitigating a risk.
What I'm trying to understand here is if the question answer options that we select is linked to the control procedures or the control standards, so they are independent. Now let's say whatever option I select, if I do not add any records for control procedure or control standards, I can still get through this stage, correct?
Yeah, you can still go to the next stage.
Okay.
And then your approval will come in and reject it because you didn't do anything. Yeah, so let me just quickly go through the sections you see here. Control procedures to be added is a section where the BTRM will add or look up a control procedure. Control procedures in place is part of that population data feed. So if it sees in a previous assessment you've said that or attached to your application you already have some control procedures addressing the control standards for this focus area, it'll automatically put them in there so that the user doesn't have to re-add them again.
Okay.
And the required control standards is just a reference so that they can look at it and say, oh, I need to address AM251. Oh, I know I have a procedure that addresses that, and then they can look it up and they can add it, or they can add a new one if they think that they address that and it isn't in the system yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So let's quickly, so the BTRM adds all this stuff in the design phase. They say, I want to move forward to challenge. Challenge is where the approver comes in, and the approver says, yep, that looks like you've addressed this correctly. You've got all the control procedures. We're addressing it. I can see where the gaps are, but you're right, there's no procedure that addresses this. And then from there it moves forward to approval.
Now, here the challenger, would it be a business application owner again who needs to address the challenge?
I will have to double check on that because I'm not entirely sure what person it is. I didn't develop this, so I'll have to double check on who it is exactly is that approver.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So after you finished all of your focus area assessments that have been outlined, which I'll just go back, where it says required focus area assessments, once all of those have been set to complete and they've all been approved, we have so these data feeds run every night, but until you finish the approval process, they won't actually do anything. There'll be no records that need to be updated. Once you've completed the approval of that, these data feeds now run through, and mainly the thing they're doing now is generating the findings. So wherever you have a control standard and you have not satisfied it with a procedure, there's a finding because there's a gap there.
So the prerequisite for data feeds to put this in place would be completing the process. Now, how I know, like there are two stages. One was a BARA status changing to complete after business owner application owner approves it, and the next stage is after you raise the third-party risk level, then you come to the control procedures, and then you finish the control procedures, then you challenge the officer for the next stage of approval. After that approval is done, then this BARA is eligible to be picked up by the data feed. Is that correct?
No, now we're on the control design assessment. So after the BARA has been approved, the data feeds run to attach control standards. After the BTRM has said, I want to generate a control design assessment because I need to address new standards, then these 4 data feeds run to update a control design assessment and focus area assessment. After the status on the control design assessment has been set to complete, because all of the assessment statuses on the focus areas are also complete, these data feeds run to generate findings.
So the BARA is not related to the control procedures. The BARA, after BARA is completed, that's done. Then the control assist. Okay, that makes sense now. Okay, thank you.
Yep. So it generates all these findings on whatever control standard was not addressed, and it attaches it to the application. So I showed here in issue management, you can see findings. You can see all the findings that are attached, the control standard that they're associated with. And that will now cause risk scores to appear on the application, which I will get to in a minute. So now that they have findings on their application, the BTRM now, comes in the next day, says, okay, these are my findings. These are areas where I've got risk that I'm not addressing. I need to address it somehow. So they will go through their finding records and begin to respond to them. By default, it's always set to pending because no one's looked at it yet. They can then change it to in process when they start working on it and filling in information. If there's remediation not planned, they can set that. That would usually be more in a situation where it's not a big risk. Most of the time, though, they need to remediate their risks. So I just have a screenshot here of a finding attached to. You can see that it was generated off of a control design assessment. That's what I highlighted. The control standard is associated with it. It's a TRMIS risk because it's based off of the TRMIS's workflow, the control design assessment. Only TRMIS can see TRMIS risk findings because this is a shared component. So if the user chooses that they need to remediate their risk in their findings, they'll now create a remediation plan record. And in here, they'll detail their plan of how they're going to remediate the risk because obviously they're not doing it right now. Their plan and finish times for it. When they estimate they'll finish, or they'll start and finish, and when they actually start and complete this remediation plan. DESR will also attach control procedures to this remediation plan to show how they're now satisfying it. So the remediation plan is, what is our plan to satisfy this? The control procedure is the actual procedure they're going through to satisfy their standard that they weren't previously. So the control procedure won't get attached until they've actually gone through and figured out what their procedure is going to be. They create a control procedure, and they attach it to the remediation plan to show how they're satisfying that finding, or they're closing that finding and addressing the standard now.
You mentioned about remediation not planned. If remediation not planned is an option, then would it just skip this stage, or is that what you tried?
Yeah, you wouldn't. If remediation's not planned, then there would be no creating a remediation plan because they don't plan on remediating it. Generally, that's only used though if this finding is going to be if there's a reason why they're not actually required to remediate it, like this, they've no longer addressing that area where the risk was anymore. Therefore, this finding's kind of invalid. Or if someone's made a mistake and they missed something in that control design assessment, they can later add that control procedure to the application to show, oh, I missed this in the control design, but I'm actually addressing this standard with this procedure. And this finding isn't valid, so I'll just say remediation's not planned on it.
Okay. So basically, a finding would only be valid when control procedures and control standards are in place. If, let's say, the workflow did not have any of this, then remediation not planned is selected just to make sure that finding is not generated or finding is not required at this point of time.
Yeah, to make sure the finding isn't counting against the risk anymore because it was created an error or this no longer needs to be addressed.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So that's essentially the end of the TRMIS's workflow, because now they've said, I'm remediating this, which will close the finding, and the control procedure will be associated with that application. So this whole process is an annual process. So after they've completed their original business application risk assessment, there's a last assessment date, which is the last time it was approved, and a next assessment date for next year.
Mm-hmm.
So then this whole process completes every year, and depending on if risks have changed or not, will depend on if they have to go through the whole process or not. If they redo their BERA and nothing has changed in their risk, they won't have to go through the rest of the process because they've already addressed this risk before and nothing's changed.
Where does how does it get defined, actually, whether they need to go through again or not?
It's all based on, after they've done the business application risk assessment,
yeah,
where they've identified risk. So if this BERA has a major in third party and a moderate in disaster. If they go through another BERA next year and they say, I have a major in third party and a moderate in disaster still, but nothing else has changed, and actually nothing's changed at all, then they've already identified what control standards were required. They've already done a control design assessment to say how they're addressing that, and they already have findings if they aren't addressing it, or remediation plans if they've fixed that in the past. Yeah.
Risk assessment is done manually, or is it something coming from the data feed every year?
The business application risk assessment, they have a next assessment date there.
Okay.
Currently, there is no automated process that says, I think there's a notification that goes out and says you need to do it soon, but there's no automated process to create a new one. And then, the user logs in and goes, oh, got to do a new one, and it's been a year.
Okay. Is it going to be an owner, or is there
the BTRM?
Oh, okay, okay.
Any of the BTRMs that belong to the BTRM team associated with that application. So if your risk is reduced or remains the same, you don't need to go through the process because there's no change, there's no additional risk to address.
Okay.
If you have increased your risk rating anywhere, you'll have to go through the whole process again because now you have to address new standards that weren't there last year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the TRMIS workflow at a high level, going through everything. And this process can take a lot longer than I've made it sound, since there's a lot of applications and they need to go through this for every application belonging to their TS area. So this process can actually take, months to actually get done.
I can imagine that. But for instance, if it is extensive, then we have 35 focus areas that need to be addressed, right?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. Okay,
and to go through each of those, add control procedures for each of those, so yes.
Yeah. So it could be a tedious process. Okay. So the focus area is, now we have this level, so low, moderate, major, extensive. You mentioned focus area can be anywhere from no till 35, right?
The focus area is a classification of control standards. So it's an area that the control standards are focusing on. So access provisioning. There's standards associated with access provisioning. So the focus area doesn't have anything to do with the risk. The control standard itself is based on, so come in depending on what kind of risk you have in each of those areas. So if you have an extensive risk in privacy, you're going to have probably every single one of the control standards for privacy that applies to privacy be required. If you have a moderate risk in privacy, there's only going to be certain ones that are required to be addressed because there's a reason you're not very risky in that area. So there's only certain standards that need to be addressed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So, overview of the TRMIS data feeds themselves. So TRMIS has 31 data feeds in production. That is the least out of all of the solutions. So this will probably be the easiest one to manage. There are 6 data feeds for the business application risk assessment workflow. Again, in the detailed session, I'll go through all these in more detail, what their purposes are. But this is just to give you a general overview. So if someone says something's not working with the Barra workflow, you can address these areas. You can see where these areas are.
So if any Barra issue, then it should be with, among those 6 data feeds. We have to. That would be our first point. So check those 6 data feeds and see if they are faulted or not, and then take the steps accordingly. If it's okay.
There are there's 19 data feeds for the control design assessment. There are 2 data feeds that work on remediation plans, and what they do is when you've attached a control procedure to a remediation plan and close that plan, the control procedure needs to be associated with the application that remediation plan is against.
So the findings doesn't have a data feed here, huh?
The finding there's finding generation based in the control design assessment workflow, but there's no data feed that operates on a finding itself. It just creates them.
Okay.
And then there are 4 data feeds in production right now. They're actually inactivated, and they're no longer used by TRMIS because they're part of the old control design process. But it's important to understand that there's a reason they're still there, or there's a reason they were put there in the first place, even though they're inactivated, because of all that historical data. It's wise not to just delete these things in case you ever need to go back and address that historical data at some point.
So the purpose of the inactivated would be only for the historical data?
Yeah. And I don't know if they'll actually ever be needed in the future, but it's important to understand why there's inactivated feeds in production for TRMIS, and to not just delete them because someone thought that maybe they got promoted by accident. They're there for a purpose, or they were there for a purpose. And all of these data feeds are in that data feed schedule, and I'll be in the detailed sessions putting that schedule in again and going through the TRMIS feed specifically. So I wanted to wrap up this part of our discussion with having a major idea of why we go through this and why this is an archer. Because if you understand the end goal, it's a lot easier to understand why TRMIS may want to make a change or what purpose these things are and why you're working with them. So the major reporting goal for TRMIS in this solution, they report on many different things. They'll report on open things, closed things, but the major thing is when they log in the morning, they hit on this workspace, the technology risk management and information security. First thing they see is this report. I got this report from CRD production, so it's not going to look like the one in ITS probably. But in the lower environments right now, this is blank. So I just took this from CRD prod. But this is the dashboard that they look at, and it shows them a roll-up of their risk in every line of business for the TS. And it bases it based on a threshold of how much risk. And this is a percentage. So they're at 10.4% risk overall on all applications of all business units in this area. So the breakdown of how this is rolled up is that control standards have risk scores associated with them for obvious reasons. Certain standards, like you have to have a password that doesn't duplicate 3 of the same characters in a row, maybe a less risky thing than a control standard that says you need to have 1 capital letter, 1 lower letter, a special character, it must be 8 characters, and it can't be the same as the last 2 passwords you entered before. That's much more strict and risk-based control standard. So based on what standards apply to your application from completing the BERA and getting your risk ratings, the application will have an inherent risk score. Because you have a major risk in third party and a moderate in availability, you have risk there. And it starts with your inherent risk. So these are things, because you have risk in those areas, this is your risk score currently. If you don't do anything, that's your score that you have. Everything after that is trying to mitigate it. So when a finding is opened on an application for a key control standard, that score is added to the residual risk. So your total score will be what your inherent is. Your residual will be what's currently the risk that you're not addressing right now. And that's how the percentages work out. You can see there's percentages on here, the residual risk ratio, the mitigated risk ratio. These things are all your maximum score is your inherent risk. Your residual risk is how much risk you have currently that's not being mitigated. So findings are obviously gaps, areas where you're not addressing this risk. So they all add up to a residual risk score. However, once you've closed that finding through a remediation plan or the standard associated with it is retired, therefore not a valid finding anymore, that score will be removed from the residual risk score because you no longer have risk in that area. Make sense?
So, Stephanie, in other words, if, let's say, there are no findings created, the inherent risk score would be equal to residual risk score? Or
if you have no findings,
yeah,
you would have no residual risk.
Okay, gotcha. So
addressed it all.
Okay. So when we create the bara and when we get to the control standards, then we at that time we define the findings. Based on the findings, the inherent risk score is defined.
No.
At that time. Okay.
No, let me go through again. So you do the BARA. You get the data feeds that run to attach control standards attached to the application. The control standards each have a score associated with them. I think the maximum is 1,000.
So control standards is adding the value too.
Oh no, it's 100. The control standards are where you get your inherent risk score from. So if you, I think the maximum is 500. If you have an extensive risk in third party, then this standard applies and it has a score of, depending on its priority, 500, 100, 50, I think 25, or 0.
So the control standard score, which is up to 500, is defined by the risk rating for third party and risk rating for that bara. Based on that, the score is defined. Once
the score on the control standard is defined outside of Archer. It's something that's defined in TD somewhere. So a standard is, if it's like a super important standard, it's a priority standard that needs to be addressed. It has a high score. If it's a standard that is in place but not as important to be addressed, it has a lower score. So coming into Archer, it has a default score. The number, the total score, is taken from all of the key control standards associated with your application.
Okay.
So if you have 10 standards and they each have a score of 100, your inherent risk score will be 1,000.
Now, is there a limit on the inherent risk score? I understand for control standard, max is 500. If there are 10 control standards, can my inherent score go to 5,000, or is it 1,000 max?
Nope, it's 5,000.
Oh, it can go to 5,000. Okay.
It goes to however many control standards you have, summing their risk scores, or their scores.
Okay. Okay, that's what I got now.
So inherent risk score is just a summation of the control standard scores. The residual risk score is a summation of a finding against a control standard.
Gotcha.
So in the beginning, before you do your control design assessment, you'll have a 0 in mitigated and a 0 in residual because you haven't addressed where you have findings yet. Once you've done the control design assessment, once you have a finding opened, you now have whatever the score is for that standard that's not addressed added to your residual risk score.
So that's neat. Now, earlier we said, once the control standards are defined and the remediation plan comes in place, and remediation plan leads to the findings, and once the finding is closed, then they are ready to be picked up by the data feeds, right?
The control procedure will be attached to the application, yes.
Yeah. So at that time, the residual score would become 0 because there are no more findings. Is that another key factor which tells if it is eligible or not?
Yeah, so the second part of my slide here, once the findings close, the score is removed from the residual risk score. So if you have 0 findings, you will have 0 residual risk. But there's one more thing I want to bring in first. Then you have a mitigated risk score. So when a control procedure is applied to a control standard through the control design assessment or through a remediation plan, the score of that control standard is removed from the residual risk score and added to the mitigated risk score.
Okay.
So from the control design assessment, you'll get certain control procedures. The score associated with that will be what your mitigated score is. If you have a finding that's added, say, 25 points to residual risk, and now you've added a remediation plan and a control procedure that's addressing that finding now, and that will, once it's attached to the application, once the remediation plan's been closed, the finding's been closed, that's been added to the application, that score will add to the mitigated risk score as well, and the residual risk score will decrease by that 25.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yeah. But I'm just curious now, how come the control procedure is affecting the residual risk score when
it only affects it once the finding's been closed.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't affect the residual risk score in reality. What it does is it adds to the mitigated risk score, but when you close that finding, because you've added that control procedure, the residual risk score decreases.
Yeah, so when you close the finding, obviously the residual risk would be reduced, but how this control procedure is actually helping or finding to reduce the risk score, that's where I'm trying. I was thinking like maybe control procedure should reduce the control standard risk, which is inherent risk score, but that's not the case here.
Yeah, I kind of wrote this from having a knowledge of this already. It's not as clear as I was hoping, but what I was essentially saying was when you've added a control procedure that addresses that finding, the finding closes, you take 25 points off the residual risk score. That control procedure is satisfying that standard, therefore adding 25 points to the mitigated risk score.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So it was a two-step process. I just kind of summarized into one. Yeah, so then you can see underneath mitigated risk ratio is your inherent risk score and your mitigated risk score. Your residual risk ratio is your inherent risk score and your residual risk score. And it shows you, because you always have that inherent risk score. You always have those standards. You always have that score associated. It's how much is mitigated from it and how much of it remains still because you haven't addressed those findings.
Okay.
So all of that rolls up. So you have an application with a residual risk of 35 points, or 315 points. And then you have multiple applications per business unit. All of those scores roll up to the business unit. Then you have multiple business units per TS area. All of those risk scores roll up to the TS area. And then in this graph you're looking at, we take the percentage out of 100%. What percent of risk does this TS area currently have? And this is how they identify areas where they need to work on their residual risk, or where things are need to have a lot more attention paid to it because they're getting pretty close to that threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So this is essentially the major reporting goal, is that they can look at this and they can say, I have a 10.4 residual risk in my WTS TS area. I have a 10% in NHCCMS. This way, the people who have to make the decisions about where they need to address these things can look at this and get a very clear picture really quickly where the highest risk is, looking at these areas, and where they need to address their attention. So that's the major goal behind this TRMIS solution and having it in Archer and bringing out this information for everyone. And I think that's just important to keep in mind when you're working on it and when you're trying to understand the motivation behind changes that are being made, and where things going wrong can mean something that's very important for them.
Yeah, where it can lead to. Because this is the place where they're going to look for their work. Now, if there is any error that happens down the line, can mislead them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it makes sense now. That's a very helpful session.
So that's my high level.
Mm-hmm.
We still have half an hour left. So if there's any questions or clarifications or comments, throw at me.
Yeah. So the data feeds that we talked about, there are like two things which you mentioned we will talk in detail. let me pull that up. The first one, it says, under details level, we will talk about the shared components and those things. And also under detail, we'll talk about the data feeds. Are you planning to have a different session for those, or?
Yeah. So if you look at the chart that Will sent out, there's going to be, I think, next Friday, a TRMIS detailed level info session on the TRMIS solution.
So in the detail section, you would be addressing how the non-shared components can be changed to the shared components. And also under data feeds, are you going to talk about how the data feeds are created? Those things?
That's Archer configuration work, so not really. We're going to talk about what's in the system at a more detailed level. So I'm going to talk, about each individual data feed, what it does, what its purpose is. Talk about when they're doing the BERA, the areas that are required or not required, or how the risk rolls up in each of the sections. Detailed information about the solution. We're not going over anything about how to configure Archer itself.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephanie, I have just one more, I guess, request. I was wondering if we can actually add the flow diagram on this individual LOBs. I think it'll help us to see a bigger picture, as well as associated with roles. So we know.
Okay. We can do that for the detailed session.
Yeah. And so I think either way, I think it's better. But in that case, we can see a bigger picture as well as who's performing which task, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be part of the details.
Yeah, what bigger is the next step? I think in that case we can have like a bigger picture and to understand, and probably it is going to help for Angelo and Ralph as well if they want to see some more higher level.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much I have. Do you guys have any other questions? No? Jessna?
I'm good for now. Probably I may come back with more questions during the detail session.
Okay. So
keep in mind also that I think we've set up for next Tuesday a question and answer period for, I haven't set up the meeting yet, but we plan on having a question and answer period for an hour on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
So if you guys think of anything in the next couple of days, you can bring them to that question and answer period, and we can address them and answer some more questions.
We do. And I actually booked all the rooms within our building from 10 to 12. So can we actually do the sessions of 10 to 12? And I think if it goes a little bit over, we can still do a bit of lunchtime, I guess, if everyone's agree. Right? I think that's kind of safe to do. Is that okay?
For the 1 hour info sessions?
No, I mean, in general, like coming up all the sessions. Just
oh, okay. So, okay. The only reason why I wanted to start at 9 was because of SAPTA.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I actually communicated to SAPTA that she said she agreed to stay till 12 an hour time. So we can do 10 to 12.
Okay. So, do you want to? Have you booked this for like the next whole month or only certain days?
We booked the whole month, all the rooms.
Okay. So pretty much every day from 10 to 12, there's a room for you guys.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's pretty much it today. We'll send you probably some questions, and so we can actually have later. Maybe we're going to collect it, and when we have the question and answer questions, probably go through. And also, how can you share the recorded file so we can actually take a look?
The recording?
Yeah.
Yep. I just have to, it needs to be converted after we're done.
Not a problem. Yeah, we'll wait for it. Okay. Great. If you guys don't have any other questions, you can wrap up. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was a great session.
No problem.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
Thank
you.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.